Thank you.
Yes,
How long would you like to, how much time do you want to give for people to join?
a couple minutes. My people are unique among real estate agents. They're early, they're on time, they're neat, they're polite.
That's
Just
great to hear.
sure,
You're right, they are unique.
just like everyone else.
No one is like you, right?
I hope not.
That would be boring. If everyone was alike, right? We
Yeah.
all have our uniqueness.
Is Margaret joining us today? Do you know if,
She is, I don't know if you saw her email. She's in another meeting and is going to join as soon as she gets out of that one.
all right, well,
Um,
she's always welcome.
yeah, she's such a hard worker.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how are things there in, I don't know, sunny? I'm not really sure where you are.
I don't either. I was
I
hoping,
mean, your back screen looks like you're in some beautiful mountain cabin somewhere that's incredible.
well, it's obviously Morgan Hill, California.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. Good to know.
Sure it is, except people that are in Morgan Hill are like, what are you talking about? That doesn't look like, it's just a random background. I need to start going to the, Halloween, the skeletons in the background, all that sort of stuff.
Scary stuff.
Yeah.
So, I do want to be able to show like at least where you're selling on the fire map to get a perspective when I touch on that a little bit with anyone who has any questions later.
Yeah. So my team is a large, I have 130 some salespeople from San Diego, LA, Orange County, San Francisco, Alameda, Santa Clara, and I probably haven't named all the areas. So you could just pick something, but it's kind of, hard to. Monterey, it's kind of hard to.
Right.
You could pick on Morgan Hill. We have lots of fires.
Right. But, and that'd be great. I'll pick on Morgan Hill. But I just wanted you to see a perspective of how many fire zones we actually have in the state of California. It's gotten very, very large. They just updated the maps in, I believe the new maps came out in January, but then they also updated the flood maps in April. So um, you can see how much of the state is just really in a high or very high severity zone by
Let
looking
me
at the
show
map.
that, and I'm going to start in a moment. Our here, just give me a second, and then maybe you could answer the question that's always, occurred to me, which is why don't the floods put out the fires? I mean, I don't know. We
Yeah.
seem to have.
How can you be in a flood zone and in a fire zone at
That's
the
right.
same?
Yeah. Why doesn't the flood just, And we're going to be broadcasting this. We'll start in 1 minute,
No problem.
and then.
Zone and in a fire zone at
That's
the
right. Yeah. Why isn't the fund? Here, let me, we're gonna be broadcast this. We'll start in 1 minute. All right. So that was the voices in my head.
I heard that.
Uh,
Very interesting.
Yeah, I know they're not real, but sometimes they have some really good ideas, you know what I mean? All right, so why don't we go ahead and we're recording this, and I want to welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up. One of the questions that I get asked a lot about disclosures and reports and things like that is, what's liquefaction and why is that mentioned in the report? Um, all right, thank you. Um, and so we're streaming to YouTube. Angela is. Talking to me. So why don't you go ahead, Laurel, tell them a little bit about who you are and who you work for and why we're doing this.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael. So, my name is Laurel Housh. I'm the Regional Vice President for DisclosureSource Northern California region. And I really love doing research and helping our clients to understand the various zones that the report provides to your buyers and sellers, and really helping step in and make things a little easier for you when it comes to certain zones, understanding them and understanding the forms you need to use. So we're going to touch on that today, while I also discuss the NHD in its basics and understanding what it teaches or what it's explaining to a potential buyer from a seller, and how it can protect that seller in disclosure. So we're going to touch on just a lot of that today in this brief discussion, but I put in the chat, and you'll see at the end Margaret's and myself contact information. So if you have questions later, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help. And so you ready to get started? Let me
All
share my
right,
screen.
let's do it.
Okay. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and we're going to start from the slideshow, play from the start. And we're going to discuss just the very basics at first about natural hazard disclosures and what they are. So if you're selling a home in California, you need to provide this NHD, natural hazard, to a buyer. And the reports were first enacted uh, not that long ago, 1998. That doesn't seem like that long ago to me. Maybe it does to some of you. But it tells a buyer of the various zones that your home, your parcel falls in. So you have special flood hazard areas, dam failure hazard areas, inundation areas, very high fire and high fire severity zones, wildland fire areas, earthquake fault zones, and seismic hazard zones. It can also include supplemental information such as radon gas exposure, airport influence areas, Megan's Law disclosures, military ordinances, and additional tax information. And even though California has a lengthy list of the disclosures that you have to provide, if your home falls into one of those six categories, you'll need some extra help helping your buyer. So that's why it's so great that you joined us today, so that you can explain the NHD to a buyer and reassure them of what they can do to protect their home and themselves. And that's why it's really important to get the professional help from a qualified realtor like yourself that can help ease the stress of navigating those legal documents and save your buyer and seller and make the transaction go smoothly. So when we look at the various NHD reports, you're going to see the hazards. There's special flood hazards. This is identified by FEMA. It's going to tell you if it may be prone to flooding, mud flow, or flood related erosion hazards. And lenders usually require homes located in special flood hazard areas to have flood insurance. Then you've got dam failure inundation. That's a little different. You don't necessarily have to have flood insurance in a dam inundation area, but just know that if you are in a dam inundation area and the dam was to break, then of course most homes in those areas are going to flood. But the flood insurance is far less for those homes than it is in a FEMA mapped area that identifies it needing the flood insurance. We're actually going to discuss that in a little more detail in a few minutes. Then there's very high and high fire severity zones. So these are areas that are susceptible to fire based on the factors like the fire history, potential fuel, and fire weather. You've got wildland fire zones. This is wildland areas that are prone to fires that are generally outside the city limits. And those still have the same parameters of disclosure that someone inside the city limits in a high or very high severity zone would have. Generally, that's taken care of by the state responsibility fire department, versus in the city limits, you're taken care of by the local fire jurisdiction. Earthquake fault zones. So these are areas that lie in an Alquist Priolo earthquake fault zone. And then seismic hazard zones. And that's an area that's prone to earthquakes as well. Then we discussed the radon gas exposure. This is areas that are high risk for radon gas. This can be naturally occurring from ground and rocks and so forth, and it can vary in the time of day, in the season. So some homeowners want to get that radon inspection, but others are not concerned because it gives the information on where you can go to do further research on that. Airport influence areas where the planes are flying over. You want to know, am I in an area where this would exist, where I'm going to hear and see planes constantly and their related noise or not? And many of us have seen planes flying over our house, but it's not a constant. If you live very close to an airport, it may be something different. And of course, your seller needs to disclose that. Megan's Law disclosure, whether or not a registered sex offender lives in the neighborhood. This is public information, but we're going to talk a little bit about how it's disclosed and what you don't want to do. Military ordnance disclosures, areas where there were formerly defensible space sites within a mile, and these sites could be inoperable, but they may still have toxic or hazardous waste materials present. And so that's going to show up in the report. Mining operations, same thing. They'll show within a mile of the property. Melrose in 1915 tax bonds. This tells us if a home is located in a district that has additional tax burdens that compensate for Prop 13, prop tax cap, or that helps with sewers, roads, streets, so forth. And so it's passed on to a buyer from a seller to pay that monthly fee for those bonds or taxes. So who pays for the NHD? Generally, it's the seller. It's something the seller is required to pay, but it can be negotiated in an offer. And if a buyer offers to pay for it, this is my message to you. Make sure that your seller will be protected by the NHD company they're using. You could only imagine if you buy a $99 report that protects you and the buyer's agent writes in, hey, we want to use this one, we'll pay for it, it's only $49, or hey, seller, we want you to provide this for $59, and there's no protection to your seller. Can you imagine if they ended up in court and they saved $20 or $30? That would be pretty upsetting. So all my message in that is vet your vendor, whoever you're using, because we are in an unregulated industry. So make sure that the NHD protects you. How much does an NHD cost? Typically $99 if you get the premium report with the tax data and the environmental, which is what DisclosureSource provides. We have a standard one. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can get it if there's no need for an environmental, and that is $75. And then we have a commercial report for those commercial properties you sell, $129. When does your seller pay for the report? You can choose to pay right up front online with a credit card, but most don't. Most bill it to escrow, and this is why this is beautiful. If you want to get ahead of the situation, order your NHD as soon as you take the listing, because you can have that attached to the MLS. You can offer that right away so a buyer can see, should I write an offer? Can I afford to get insurance on this property? Do I want to buy this property, instead of backing out after you get into escrow and then realize, oh, I've looked at the NHD and I don't want to go forward. Plus, there's no cost from DisclosureSource if you do not close. So you can order that with no risk. Just take that NHD and use it to help you continue on transparent in the transaction. Who prepares the natural hazard statement? A third-party company should prepare this report, never the agent, because there's so many components that you have to research, plus the liability. And so a reputable NHD company will help make sure that they're behind the laws and regulations that are constantly changing, and make sure that those are part of the report. So know this, that when we prepare the report, we pay for an errors and omissions policy to protect you and your broker. And that is $60 million in E&O that we provide to all parties, including your transaction coordinator and your escrow officer, the broker, the agents, and so forth. And why is the hazard, what hazard is not included in the NHD? The hazards like molds, termite, the presence of asbestos are not covered in NHD reports. Those hazards can be uncovered during home inspections, and the seller may be required to disclose those facts that are previously known. So here we're looking at two maps. The natural hazard that we provide provides a statutory map. This is the state map. This is important to know the difference between the two because they are going to look different sometimes. And you'll see things on the state map that are not on the local maps or vice versa. So the state map, for the purposes of today's discussion, is the map that drives whether or not your seller will potentially need to provide the FHDS, the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure. That's so misunderstood. And we're going to have a class coming up on that one as well. But just know this, if they fall in a high or very high severity zone or a wildland area, they are going to need to look at the pages to see if they must provide it based on the legal parameters, which I'll touch on briefly today. The local maps help with greater transparency for your seller to the buyer and show other fault zones that they fall in local that the state has not mapped, but the local jurisdiction has mapped. And then you'll notice the signing page comes next. And what's new on that signing page, you're going to see here in this section, right under the high or very high severity zone of fires, it'll tell you what responsibility you're in. Are you in a state responsibility area that's high, a very high responsibility area, or a very high local? And the reason this is important is because this is going to help your seller if they have to provide the FHDS, the fire hardening and defensible space form. It will help them check the correct box on their form. The other thing I wanted to mention is the last time they changed the RPA, they added in that links are now considered delivery. So you'll see at the bottom of the signing page, we have linked the EQ book, the Protect Your Home, the Homeowner's Guide to Earthquake Safety, and the Energy Rating, the HERS book, all is linked right there on the signing page. So when a buyer signs this page, they've agreed that they received all those booklets. My recommendation is encourage your buyer to read the booklets. You do not have to prove that they read them. You can't hold their hand, but you can send them a funny email and say, hey, you might have a sleepless night. So I'm going to give you something to get to sleep with. Here, click on these links and read these booklets. It'll help you get to sleep. And by the way, if you get the late night munchies, no chewing on the baseboards. They might have lead-based paint, as this booklet explains. So you could make it funny, and if they reply, you're pretty much golden. But most agents that work with a transaction coordinator will also get those signed separately. And we will soon have separate signing pages also attached in a file for you to make it even easier. Okay. The beauty of this NHD is that it's live and interactive. So let's say that you are reviewing this with your buyer, and the buyer says, hey, can we go back and look at the wildland fire area that, or the very high severity zone it fell in? All you need to do is go to these two pages where it tells you where everything is in the report and click on that line item that you want to review. And it will take you straight to that section of the report on the live report that we send you. So it's very easy to navigate through the report and look at various different portions of it with your buyer or seller. Now, here's a quick overview of the FHDS, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space, because obviously you're in an area, and I can show you the CAL FIRE maps after we're finished with this review, that are going to have more often than not fire zones that your buyers are going to need to look at, and whether or not you're going to need to get fire insurance if it's going to be required. So if a seller falls in a high or very high severity zone, they may need to fill out this form and provide it to a buyer. This form allows a seller to tell a buyer, hey, I'm in a fire zone that requires I talk to you about it, and what I have done to protect my home, and what I'm willing to do, or what I have not done and what I'm not willing to do, and what I want you to take on the responsibility of. And that's what this form does, is it allows that seller to pass on the responsibility if they don't want to take care of it or if they have not taken care of creating defensible space around the home. So there are some specific parameters on this form, and we're not going to do a deep dive today, but we will revisit that. Michael scheduled that for your office, and I will go over this form in detail and give you lots of nuggets on how to help a seller when selling in a high or very high severity zone. But I did want you to know that we do offer that and help with that. If you take a listing in a fire zone prior to the class that we have, or if you're not able to attend, but I hope you can, then please reach out to Michael and he will be happy to give you my information if you can't see it or write it down today. And I'm there for you if you need some help. And Margaret's there for you as well. But you're almost always going to see the WFDA, that's the Wildfire Disaster Advisory, in your forms. And when you close escrow, it's almost always provided to a buyer, even if you're not in a high or very high severity zone. That is the disclosure advisory that you're going to want to provide if your seller legally does not have to provide the FHDS. So just a quick word of advice. If you're the buyer's agent and you're in a transaction where you see the NHD has them in a high or very high severity zone, wildfire, wildland area as well, and you do not receive this form, the FHDS, which talks about who took on the responsibility, but you do get the WFDA, make sure that your buyer understands what they're taking on. It's a very serious conversation because you don't want to have them upset with you later with tens of thousands of dollars in fire mitigation that they were supposed to have done. Now, here's a quick, and we're going to look at the map live and in person, but I wanted to show you that you can use it prior to going out on your listing and get some education on if the home is in a fire zone. What are the responsibility areas and what's the severity level? If you look at the NHD, you'll see a page called the AB 38 notice. It tells if this property is located in a high or very high severity zone, and it gives a link for your seller to get the inspection. By the way, no one but the seller, unless you have written permission from that seller, can schedule that inspection. It's a government inspection. We also provide you with a link on how to prepare the home. And I have some more information on that I'll be sharing in the Selling in Fire Zones class that Michael has scheduled. Here's a quick snapshot of selling in a FEMA map zone. So if you go to the FEMA website, you can actually type in, search their dynamic map and look at parcels and what zones they fall in. And they have key codes that explain those zones, such as the A and the V. Anything with an A or V letter is definitely in a zone that can be challenging and probably is going to be needing flood insurance. But there's more. We help you with that as well because you don't need to search that. We provide in the NHD whether or not they fall in a FEMA special flood hazard area. So you can see from this map, this particular parcel fell in a dam inundation area, but not in a FEMA special flood area. And the pages that discuss that within the NHD report will tell you if it is or is not, or if it's not mapped. Sometimes the information is just not available in some parcel situations, and it will say it's not mapped by the state or the local jurisdiction. But if it is in a flood zone, then we're going to help you even further. So here's a parcel that fell in a FEMA mapped zone. So what I've done is I've added on a flood cert that we provide. So anytime your seller's parcel falls in a FEMA map zone, we automatically order a flood cert for you and attach it to the NHD. If you don't get it, it might be because someone forwarded you the NHD, like the escrow officer or the transaction coordinator. Make sure they forward you the flood cert as well that's attached separately, because that's going to give you some important pieces of information. It's going to tell you if the parcel has had what's called a LOMAR or a LOMAC, a letter map of revision or a letter map of change. And if it has had that, it's going to have the date when it was done. And then it's going to tell you more in the determination section. It's a yes or no. If the box is checked yes, insurance is required. If the box is checked no, then there may not be any flood insurance required, but there's still a risk in that area. It's not removed completely. So that can help you with your lender. If, let's say, for instance, my neighbor has a creek behind his house and it's FEMA mapped, and he used to have flood insurance, but he built 2 wings onto the back of his house. To do that build, he got an elevation survey. It wasn't cheap, cost him $2,600, he told me, but he had to have it to do the build. And they determined from his elevation and his seawall that he had built behind his house, because it was a very steep drop off, and he put a fence above it because he has small children. Because of all of the things that he has going on, his home's elevation was high enough that he would not flood if that creek was to rise. So he actually changed he was able to get that letter map of change or revision. And now his search shows that he does not need flood insurance. So you may see that. If you're looking at one of these certificates, your seller may have, or the builder may have at one time in the past got a certificate based on their elevation survey. So that's also included, by the way. And then we're going to talk about earthquake, seismic, landside, and liquefaction zones, which Michael brought up. So the report is going to tell you whether it's mapped or not. If it is in a seismic hazard zone or a liquefaction area, it will tell you. Liquefaction zones are areas that have a potential for the ground, the soil, sometimes moves with an earthquake and groundwater, and it can bring liquid to the surface. And these factors combine with the area. When that occurs, it may settle and things may move around, and that may cause problems with the structure. So this is necessary for a seller to disclose if they are in a seismic or liquefaction zone. Then you've got supplemental flood hazard areas, is or is not in one of those. All of those supplemental disclosures are also provided in the report. So there's all kinds of fire, flood, geologic, and so forth. Then the additional disclosures, there's commercial, industrial zoning, airport, we talked about influence areas, airport proximity, what the proximity from the parcel to an airport is, the right to farm, the right to farm, if you're going to smell your neighbor's cows and so forth, the mining operations, if it's in a mining operations area, and then, oh my goodness, notices and advisories. Well, there are many that have to be provided. So there's a list of some of them, but here's the key to this. Disclose when you must. You absolutely must disclose when it's required by law. But if it's not mandated by law, you want to advise, because let me explain. Gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines would be one example, or Megan's Law. So you disclose or provide the documentation or advisories for a buyer, and they can go do the research. When you look at gas pipelines, if you go to the maps, they'll tell you that they're not accurate. Sometimes they're tens of feet or hundreds of feet off. So it's important for your buyer to do that research and see if they're comfortable with where they're purchasing. That's up to them. Just the same as with Megan's Law. You don't go and do the research for them. You allow them to, because that changes all the time. New people pop up in that database regularly. So that would not be your responsibility to search their database for who might be a sex offender on that database. You want your buyer to do that research for themselves. So certain things are important, like radon, naturally occurring asbestos, and so forth, that the buyer do the research themselves to see what they're comfortable with. And then the tax data. So a property we're going to tell you in the report what the current basic property taxes are. We're also going to tell them about voter approved taxes. You might have certain things like mosquito abatement and so forth. And then other direct assessments and Melrose and 1915 bonds are going to show up on this report. One of the biggies that I think you need to look for when you look at the report is Hayes, Hero, Y Green energy loans, because those are not transferable to a buyer. In most cases, the lender won't take second position. So if a seller has gotten a PACE loan in the past, an energy loan that is a tax lien against their property for solar, roofing, heat and air, water heaters, windows, all kinds of things that they can get these loans for, and they have not paid it off, they may have a 20 or 25-year loan with that PACE loan, and it cannot be passed on to a new buyer in most cases. And most buyers don't want to pay for the roof that was put on 10 years ago. They don't want to pay for the solar again or the new windows, because that price is also in the cost of the home. So that may be a negotiation of paying that off, or may not even be negotiable. Your seller may need to pay that off prior to close of escrow or in escrow, because most lenders, like I said, won't take second position. So super important to look at the taxes and see what those additional taxes might be. It'll usually be called an energy loan, but it'll also have an acronym based on the loan and how they got it. So just know those are also disclosed in the report in the tax section, as long as they've been recorded, which most of the time sellers don't get that type of loan and then turn around and sell. That would be really horrible if they did. And by the way, I have a script on that if you want to call your database about protecting their equity. There are better ways to put a roof on than a PACE loan, because it's stretched out over such a long period of time. By the time you pay it off, if you borrowed 10,000 or 15 or 20,000, it could be into almost 100,000 by the time you've paid it off in that stretch of time. There's also a supplemental tax estimator built into the report. How can this help you get more business? Well, you can talk to your buyer about the fact that they're going to receive this tax bill. It usually comes 6 months, 8 months, it just depends on the county. After close of escrow, it's the difference between what the seller was paying in taxes and what their tax bill is going to be. That difference can be pretty substantial based on the original home, the seller's taxes and where they are, and now the cost of the purchase price of the property. But this estimator is built into the report and allows you to calculate that with your buyer. Sometimes it can be negotiated. Generally, escrow won't pay it, but the lender can sometimes pay it into the escrow account. Make sure you tell your buyer, if you get a rebate check from escrow, it might have been for this. Don't spend that money. You may need it to pay off this supplemental tax bill when it comes to you. So be careful about not spending that money. Now, why not put a tickler on your phone in your calendar to call your buyer a few months after close of escrow and remind them about this bill, that it is coming. And then you could call them again in a couple of months and remind them again. It's a great reason to call them back. And also, like I mentioned, I have a script on the PACE loans if you would like it. Margaret can send that over to you, and this script as well on the supplemental tax estimator. Happy to share that with you. And then we're looking at the environmental report. The environmental report is going to search a radius of a mile around that parcel. And it's going to tell you the known concerns and potential concerns in an area around that home. And many buyers want to know what is near my home that's a concern. I want to know if I can plant a garden. I want to know what I live near, and they have to be willing to accept that. Most buyers know, hey, I'm buying around the corner from a gas station or a grocery store. I'm okay with that. But if there's something that they're not okay with, they get to do the research themselves. We provide them all the data they need, and they go forward with the research. And we give them the whole list of, when we give them what the concerns are, it's going to be categorized into A, known concerns, category B, sites with potential environmental concerns, and category C, sites registered with underground storage tanks. And of course, the address will be there, We will tell them the status, whether it's closed, clean and closed, or whatever. If you're looking at the status and you're not sure what it means, just go to the alphabetical list that we give you, the potential status field definitions, and they're all in alphabetical order explaining what those mean. So it's very easy. And of course, you've got Margaret and myself to walk you through if you need any help with it at all. So why disclosure source? If you're making a selection, we respect and appreciate that you've got a choice. You can choose whoever you want to provide your NHDs for you. But in the civil code, if you read it, the responsibility of who you choose to protect your seller falls on you, the agent, and your broker. So you want to do your homework. It's kind of like doing your homework on picking the best home inspector who knows what they're doing. And you guys all have, I know that you've had a bad home inspection in the past at some point, and you know what it looks like, or someone who didn't catch something on a termite and dry rot inspection. So you pick the best for your clients. And that's what my message is. Make sure to vet your NHD company and make sure that they are protecting you and your seller. You can't get more protection than Disclosure Source. We carry, like I said, $60 million in errors and omissions. We're owned by Fidelity, and you don't want to waive your rights to that, which many companies do say that. And then, of course, you've got Margaret, and she is an amazing resource for you. And you can order. She's your one-stop shop. So she does both Fidelity Home Warranty and Disclosure Source because we're both owned by Fidelity. And so here I've put in the on the screen Margaret's cell phone number and the 800 number to order. And then, of course, you've got me as a resource as well. And I am more than happy to help with anything that I can do to help you in natural hazard disclosure questions that you have. Now, if you'd like, I'd like to share with you the if you're interested at all in looking at the fire zones. Here's the maps, the current maps. So if you're taking a listing in a fire zone, this is a really easy thing for you to do. You can simply type in the address and search and prepare for your listing. And we're going to review this in detail with our fire selling in fire zones class that Michael set up with you. But I'm going to go ahead and ask you if you have any questions. Please feel free to ask away. Okay, no questions? Wow.
Let me ask one. In the environmental hazards, earthquake, cellar, earthquake disclosure, you know, the page where if it was built before 1960, it's a wood frame, or 1975 masonry and wood. Seller has to fill out that form, right? Which is also part of the environmental book. There's also a duct, not D-U-C-K, but D-U-C-T disclosure. And I get asked questions by agents because, first of all, a lot of the earthquake questions, you know, they don't know what a cripple wall is, or, you know, are the joists, you know, bolted? Who knows? You know, that sort of thing. So do you have any advice for agents on that? Did you want to do a earthquake one at some point? Because, you know, we have
You're kind of in the middle of an earthquake fault zone, aren't you?
fire,
Yeah.
floods, and earthquakes. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got it all going on there. So we can discuss that at another time. I mean, earthquakes, you know the zone, and we're going to show you the fault zone. And we are going to provide you with the documentation you need. But who can say when anything's going to happen, right? I mean, none of us have that crystal ball. And so it's simply protecting your seller by making sure that they read the booklets and understand why they have their water heater strapped. Where is a safe place to go if there was an earthquake? You know, those booklets explain all of that to them. And it's just, you know, a good agent is going to sit down with their buyer and say, hey, it doesn't, you know, this is the thing I say. It doesn't matter where you live in California, you're going to be in a zone somewhere, some kind of zone. It's all risk and reward. It's kind of like, do you want to get married? Well, you want to take the risk? And the reward, there's a lot of people don't feel there's the reward to that. So they decide no. But you want to live in California, it's beautiful. We have the most beautiful state, from the mountains to the oceans, but there's always risk wherever we live, right? And so we just have to accept that whether or not we're willing. I mean, a lot of people moved to North Carolina and to Florida recently, because the sales or the taxes and so forth is so much better. Look what they just went through. They had no idea that was going to hit them like that. So I think it's the conversation with the buyer is about understanding that you're not going to live somewhere where there's no risk. You're always going to have a risk, no matter where you live. You just have to be prepared for whatever risks come your way. So, um, that's a good agent that's going to have those discussions about but not make it scary and daunting, with the NHD. And so, who knows when an earthquake could occur and where could be the epicenter and where could be the most hit. Who knows when a tsunami could hit or a fire could hit? What area is going to be affected? We don't know that. All we know is that we, as the agent, have to make sure our seller discloses the correct things legally and they follow the law and the buyer makes an informed decision. So I think it's like there's a fine line of not scaring them, but at the same time helping them to make that informed decision. So you brought up this particular, I'm going to share just this current slide. You brought up this, and we're going to have a deep discussion on this with I'm sorry, I'm not looking at my calendar right now, Michael, but when the selling in fire zones is, and that's going to be a deep dive, right? But this form you brought up. So CAR has not created all these different disclosure forms for every hazard. The NHD, they've required that you provide the NHD as a seller to a buyer, which is going to tell about earthquake zones and so forth. And then you got the earthquake book itself that they have to sign that gives you all the data they need to understand if they live in an earthquake zone. But everyone gets that earthquake book. I don't care where you live if you don't live in an earthquake zone, because it could happen anywhere. This is a little different. This particular disclosure, while the NHD tells you if you're in a fire zone and what the severity level is, this is the requirement from a seller to a buyer who meets the legal parameters as to what they have or have not done. And CAR has specifically created this disclosure because there are so many issues with homeowners who have not created defensible space and passed it on to the buyer. And then the buyer gets in and gets CAL FIRE or the local fire department coming by saying, hey, you're not in compliance. You have to do these things. So this protects your seller in several ways. It can be, hey, I've done all these things and here's my documentation, or I'm not willing and I'm passing the responsibility on to you, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer. And so there's where an agent really needs to know their stuff. Because if their buyer is purchasing in a zone, they have to talk to that buyer about what they're taking on. If the seller doesn't want to do the things, they can give over the responsibility. They do not have to do it by law. Even though, here's what's funny or interesting about this, not so funny. If you, as a homeowner, selling or not, live in a fire zone that is high or very high severity, you're actually required by law to create defensible space. Many homeowners don't have it, have not created it, but they're required. It's just like you're in your car and you're driving down the freeway and you know what the speed limit is. Is everybody driving the speed limit on the freeway? No. You can't control what other people are doing. You can only control what you're doing, right? And so this is kind of making people drive the speed limit, if you will. In certain areas, it's making sellers provide defensible space or ask the buyer to do so. That's what this form does. It just protects them from wildfire with better, and you can go on CAL FIRE's site. I showed you the AB 38 page we have, and how that will help a buyer see homes that have had defensible space created. You can see pictures of homes that had all the defensible space and there was a fire in the area and their home was saved versus others that didn't have it. So that's why this form is really crucial if you take listings in fire zones to understand. And also, it's really crucial to understand this if you're a buyer's agent and you get it or you don't get it. Because if you get it as a buyer's agent from the seller and the listing agent, you're going to sit down with your buyer and review it and see what they're asking. Have they done it? This is amazing. This is awesome. Or are they asking you to take on the responsibility? So it's really important for agents to understand both sides of this for both their seller and their buyer, and advise their sellers if they're in a zone that requires it. What do you want to do? Talk to me about this. It might be a new negotiation. If the seller doesn't want to do anything and there's a lot of cleanup work that needs to be done, it could be a costly proposition for a buyer to take on. And have you seen in the RPA the wildfire disaster or the wildfire report that you can order? There's a pop down, and we'll discuss it in detail on the selling in fire zones class. But since you brought it up, that is a very challenging report. I'm going to tell you right now. I look at them a lot. And I've seen homeowners that have completely created defensible space, had tree companies out there, trimmed everything up, trimmed away from the home, removed trees, had it beautifully cleaned, gutters cleaned out, roof cleaned out, everything. And that report said they needed $25,000 worth of defensible space mitigation done. It's aerial imagery only. It is a very difficult report in your transaction. There are better ways to get the information and to negotiate for your seller and buyer on that defensible space, because it's a tough one, I'm going to tell you right now. And eventually they'll be getting in bed with tree removal companies and companies that enclose the eaves and do all that work and cover the drain and the gutters and so forth. And then the cost will be even greater, even though they kind of do that already if you answer those questions. So just be prepared and cautious of that, because if a buyer asks for it, it's $140. You can go through their company. It's called Fortress Fire on their website to order it, but I have seen it kill deals repeatedly. So be very cautious about that report, okay? So I'm just telling you because I don't work for them. I just look at the reports and see what it does. So it's important to know your documents that are required by law, and the NHD can help you with that, to know what you need. Looks like we have a question from Jasjot.
Hey, Laurel. So I have a question regarding the NHD environment info, specifically the leaking underground storage tanks.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way to know what substance is being stored that might be leaking? And also it's under category B. So does it mean it has the potential to leak, or is it definitely leaking?
So if it's in category B, it has a potential. It hasn't been identified as leaking, if that's where it falls, but it's identified that it's there and there's a potential. If the EPA called it out and they've had it cleaned, you're going to see in the status section, cleaned and closed. Do you remember back in the day? I haven't seen it for a while, but sometimes you'll be driving down the road and you'll see this green fence put up around an old gas station, and all the dirt has been dug out when the tank's removed, and then they cleaned all that dirt and then put it back down and compacted it and maybe built a restaurant over it or whatever. So if you looked that, it's never going to go off the EPA, but you'd look it up and you would see the determination and that it was clean and closed, versus one that's just open. Obviously, if you have a gas station that's functioning, that you can go fill up, you've got, I don't know, Costco and all their gas stations, they're going to show up on there on the EPA and it's active, but it may not be leaking. So it's just going to show up on the report, but not be an active leaking site. but it'll be under category C, which is lust, or there's an acronym for that for the underground storage tanks, okay? And it will show you the status. Look at the status on the report.
So the status of informational item, what would that stand for?
Pardon me, I didn't hear you.
Status informational item?
So you'd have to go back to, let me go back to the report and let me get that page. Okay. So, oh my, I don't have that page. I'm sorry. So it should have a description of the address of where it is, and then go to the pages where the status definitions are and look down in the alphabetical order for that particular status definition, and it will explain it exactly what it is.
I see. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Any other questions we can answer for you?
Margaret, want to say something? Are you?
Well, Margaret is your awesome sales executive, and she is there to help you and take care of you. And so, yeah, if you need an order, if you need a report, just
Yeah, I made it here too. So
thanks,
I made it
Margaret.
to the last part of your meeting. Sorry, I was a little bit late. But yes, you can always call me, but please call the cell phone. I don't pick up the 800 number call that fast. So please call my cell phone if you have any other questions on the outside of the meeting.
And text are always great because sometimes
Yes.
Our sales executives and like myself right now, I'm not answering any phone calls or any, messages. But if you text me, sometimes the sales executives will have a break between a class they're doing or whatever. Then they can look at their text messages and see, and then send out, hey, I need data on this particular client's home, or here's where that you can find that. And sometimes it's easy to answer text messages. That's
Yes, absolutely, 100%.
Beauty of our modern age, right?
Yep.
All right. And I put in the screen Margaret's cell phone number here, you can see. And then, of course, you have mine below. But, you can reach out to Margaret if you need help. And if it's a deeper dive on a question that she's not sure about, she'll send you to me.
Absolutely. I sure will.
And did you have
our transaction coordinator has all of the contact information. Margaret put in her phone number as well. I have a comment though before we wrap, if that's okay.
Yeah. So I was just looking at the chat real quick, Michael.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't sure if anything was there that you needed, but someone had asked, Bola had asked for our company contact number. So yeah, I'm sure you have brochures, but we have the 800 number on that screen that I was sharing. Let me just share that again.
I gave Bola your information and he thanked me. So
and in the chat but there's our 800 number for our company itself. But then we also, there's Margaret's cell phone.
There looks like there's too many numbers there, Laurel.
For what? Oh, I typed too many in the 800. I'm so sorry. Okay. Well, that was my bad. I apologize. So let me just look up the correct number. So get rid of the 308. I apologize. Get rid of the 308. It's just 800-880-9123. I'll fix that. Sorry about that. All right. Can we answer anything else about the natural hazard for you? Scott, did you have something you wanted to ask? Okay. You were going to say something, Michael?
Yes. A long time ago, when I was in real estate starting off, that was like 50 years ago, something like that. The environmental hazards book, which we sometimes called the Green Book, was printed on what looked like newsprint. And for those of you that are young, newspapers, you have to Google it. But, and the home warranty companies would have an ad on the back and would give us a stack of these booklets. And the booklet, if you printed it all out, is kind of thick. And one of the advantages of having the printed out booklet is that when you're doing a buyer consultation, what I would include in the package is I would show them the booklet and even suggest, not just suggest that they read it, but maybe mention some of the issues that they might want to protect themselves from. Now, Laurel had mentioned you don't want to scare them or worry them unnecessarily. My theory would be scaring them a little bit wouldn't be too bad, because what would happen by going over the earthquake and the environmental hazards and the duct tape and what radon gas is, and I've had radon gas inspections, I've had asbestos inspections, then the buyer starts to see that there may be more involved in this transaction than simply writing an offer and talking to a lender. And that makes your value proposition as a buyer's agent stronger, because they might find an agent that'll help them buy the property and not charge very much, but they're unlikely to be going through all the different diligence that a agent that understood what was going on and was committing to helping them might do, which is one of the reasons that I've invited Laurel and Margaret to talk on other occasions as well, because understanding what's in that book and what the issues are would be very valuable for a buyer's agent. And since you guys are obviously all on it and understand, you know already that if you go into the California Association of Realtors, car.org, and you go to zip forms and you're going to add a form, I'm sure you all know this already, but in the drop down where it says libraries, one of the libraries is called EPUB. And what EPUB has, among other things, is all of these booklets. And although it is true that the NHD report has links and asks them to sign it, you could actually send them the whole booklet or save the booklets into some sort of a folder that you could discuss with the buyer. One of my issues as a broker involved in transactions is that it seems that agents always get buyers to sign a receipt for the environmental hazards booklet, the earthquake, and all of the others, but no real effort is usually made to make sure that the buyer actually has a copy and has even looked at it. We just get their signatures because the listing agent has the signature block, sends it to us. The buyer signs it without really knowing what it is. There's links in the NHD, but they usually don't click on them. This might be something useful to talk about in a buyer consultation. That's my
I
thought.
think that's wonderful. And I would agree that you want to be transparent with a buyer because you want them not only to feel comfortable and like you care about them, but also you want them to refer you. You want them to tell their friends and family and coworkers what a great agent you are. And there's just a how you present it. I mean, like what I meant was not to scare them, like some people are, oh my goodness, the reality is this. This is the reality. We all have it. There's a speed limit. You have to know it. You have to drive it, right? But you can't force people to do it. So I love that you do that. And actually, if you do ever go to your local board, you can buy those paper copies of the EQ book. So if your client is elderly and they don't receive things electronically, you can buy a paper copy of those booklets at the board. They're not expensive.
If somebody reads the environmental book carefully, they won't want to sleep in their house because they'll be worried about asbestos and formaldehyde. And then they think, well, maybe we ought to sleep in the backyard in a tent. At that point, they get to the radon gas section and they're like, oh my gosh, that's not safe either. So I'm just sort of kidding a little bit, but it would be good for your clients to understand the risks of what you could do as an agent to help them find out. That's my thought for the day.
It makes sense to me too. I put the main number in the chat. Margaret put her cell number and I put my cell number in the chat. And so if you need any help at all with an NHD or with a home warranty, well, you know who you can call because Margaret is there for you. And we love working with you guys.
Well, cool. Thank you very much. Looking forward to doing some more of these. I
So
think,
hopefully everyone on today will come to the selling in flood zones or the selling in fire zones that we have scheduled,
and then we can do earthquake sometime.
if you want to.
With, well, it's,
Pick it up a little bit.
yeah, shake it up. I sold the house one time. It was technically in Watsonville, and the cross streets were San Andreas and Loma Prieta. Those were the two streets.
And yet people live there and
Oh
they
yeah, he
there.
said the lenders wouldn't lend on it, but you know, he wanted it. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much for having us.
All right, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.